Now, in my opinion, one of the most misunderstood characters in all of Star Wars, and perhaps the greatest example of a true Jedi we've seen thus far in the canon, is Qui-Gon Jinn. However, all too often Qui-Gon gets labeled as a gray Jedi, a term that can refer to either someone who walks the line between the light and the dark side of the Force, or to a Jedi that has distanced themselves from the Council. And although an argument could be made that he fits the latter, since we even hear Obi-Wan speak of how Qui-Gon defies the Council right in the Phantom Menace, I still think it's a poor term to describe him when one considers it was the Council that had distanced itself from the ideals of the Jedi, while Qui-Gon held true to them in their purest form. In fact, throughout the course of Episode 1, the only Jedi we ever hear even speak of the will of the Force, and keep in mind carrying out this will is the one and only purpose of the Jedi as they seek to maintain balance within the Force, is Qui-Gon Jinn. Instead, the Jedi of the prequel era have become tools of the Republic, not the Force. They now serve at the whim of the Supreme Chancellor and the Senate, and at the start of Episode 1, we see they've allowed themselves to become glorified diplomats and negotiators, and later in the prequels we watch as they become warriors and generals, and none of these things are what the Jedi were ever supposed to be. We also learn that the Jedi of this time, at least to some extent, put stock in such things as midi-chlorian counts, and use them to judge potential and likely who will and who won't be trained. In other words, instead of listening to the will of the Force, they have come up with other ways of deeming who should and shouldn't become a Jedi. And relying on other means to determine this is likely due to a disconnect with the Force, something even Mace Windu speaks of when he asks Yoda if they should inform the Senate that their ability to use the Force is diminishing. Further evidence of this disconnect is when Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan go before the Council and inform them of this dark warrior that they've encountered, and Qui-Gon concludes it must have been a Sith. But Mace Windu argues that he does not believe the Sith could have returned without their knowing, implying he has not sensed anything out of the ordinary through the Force. However, at the start of the Phantom Menace, we hear young Obi-Wan, Padawan of Qui-Gon who is no doubt being trained the ways of the true Jedi, speak of a threat he feels out there, something elsewhere, elusive, which were no doubt the Sith and the plan they were just starting to hatch. Hell, it wasn't until Revenge of the Sith, at the bitter end of the Clone Wars, that we hear Mace Windu speak of feeling a plot to destroy the Jedi, a plot young Padawan Obi-Wan had felt brewing years before the Clone Wars ever even began, which should tell you just how out of favor with the Force a vast majority of the Jedi had fallen. The problem for Obi-Wan, though, is he strayed from the path of a true Jedi as well. This is evident by the fact that he becomes a member of the Council, something that no doubt would have never happened if he would have stayed true to what he'd been taught by Qui-Gon about only heeding the will of the Force, which begins to show why Obi-Wan failed in training Anakin, or the Chosen One, and highlights just how tragic it was that Qui-Gon was killed by a Sith before he could go on to train Anakin like a true Jedi. And all of this, to me, points to the conclusion that Qui-Gon Jinn was not a gray Jedi, but rather he was the only Jedi left at the time, or at least the only one we saw in The Phantom Menace, and that one could even say it was a clear majority of the rest of the Jedi who could be deemed something like gray Jedi for not adhering strictly to the will of the Force in an effort to only maintain balance. It also says to me Qui-Gon was, in a sense, a chosen one himself, or chosen by the Force to train the chosen one because, as Qui-Gon himself says to Anakin, it was no accident that he found him, which begins to answer a question you might already have forming in your head. And that is, if Qui-Gon was a true Jedi who defied the will of the Council and only followed the will of the Force, why at the start of the Phantom Menace is he heading to Naboo, at the behest of the Supreme Chancellor, to negotiate a trade dispute? This seems like the exact opposite of something he'd ever do. But the answer to this is quite simple. He is following the will of the Force. No doubt he feels or senses that the Force wants him to go to Naboo to protect Queen Amidala. He even says at one point, "I can only protect you, not fight a war for you," even implying her protection is the true mandate the Force has given him. What he doesn't initially realize is the ultimate reason behind the Force sending him to Naboo isn't just to protect Padme, but to actually discover and maybe even eventually train Anakin. Though it's also not out of the realm of possibility that he was never meant to train Anakin, that everything, including the rise of the Empire and the coming of Darth Vader, was exactly how it was all meant to transpire. Perhaps the only thing Qui-Gon was meant to do was to bring Padme and Anakin together, so that fate or destiny could play out exactly as it did, which ultimately led to both the end of the wayward Jedi of the prequel era and the end of the Sith, and left us with one lone Jedi, Luke Skywalker of course, who should have gone on to rebuild the Jedi Order as it was meant to be. Either way, it seems clear that Qui-Gon's strict adherence to the will of the Force in Episode 1 is what allowed events to play out as they did, and I suppose, in the grand scheme of things, whether he was meant to train Anakin or just facilitate this meeting between Anakin and Padme is irrelevant considering what the end result was, a balanced Force. Further evidence of Qui-Gon's strong commitment to the will of the Force is that, at first, Qui-Gon had no interest in saving Anakin. He even tells him at one point, "I didn't actually come here to free slaves." And one might think that if a Jedi encountered an enslaved child, and one who repeatedly offered to help him, that he'd feel compelled to save that enslaved child. But initially, Qui-Gon does not, because he does not feel it is the will of the Force for him to act and do so. It's only when he begins to realize that, again, as he himself later says, it was no chance encounter that he found Anakin, that he decides to save him, and also that he tried to save Anakin's mother, which may have been the will of the Force as well, since it may have known that Shmi was one day going to be killed by Tuskens on Tatooine, and that it would result in the first step Anakin took towards the dark side. The last piece of evidence that Qui-Gon should be considered the epitome of a true Jedi, and not a gray one, is that he was the first Jedi to successfully become a Force ghost. And according to the Clone Wars animated show, which is of course canon, this can only happen if one lets go of all attachments and overcomes all fear, which is essentially the most heightened state a Jedi could possibly reach and one they should all strive for. Which is again further proof that his devotion to the true ways of the Jedi and his steadfast holding to the will of the Force is the reason why the Sith were ultimately defeated. For if Qui-Gon never becomes a Force ghost, he never comes back to help train Yoda to become one. And then of course Yoda teaches Obi-Wan how to commune with Qui-Gon so that he too can become a Force ghost. And eventually, as a Force ghost, Obi-Wan tells Luke to go to Dagobah to be trained by Yoda. And none of that ever happens if Qui-Gon hadn't initially succeeded. So as much as people like to throw the gray Jedi label on Qui-Gon Jinn, maybe because it makes him feel edgier or something, I really don't know, it is one that simply does not fit. He was a true Jedi, and by following the will of the Force, played his part in bringing balance to it, which again, is the one and only goal of the Jedi. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to let me know what you think about Qui-Gon Jinn being called a Grey Jedi. Is it a title that fits, or is it ridiculous and he should just ever only be referred to as a true Jedi? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.